Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious reality behind one of history's most haunting figures. What reads like legend once smelled of vinegar, dried herbs, and the overwhelming scent of decay. The truth is, facing that kind of contagion, you probably wouldn't last a day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's journey together. The world did not end with a bang, nor a whimper. It ended with a ship, or rather, with a fleet of ships, 12 of them, Genoese galleys limping home from the Black Sea. They appeared on the horizon of Messina, in Sicily, in the autumn of 1307, their sails slack, their oars moving with a spectral lethargy. The people of Messina who gathered at the harbour saw a crew of dead and dying men with black boils the size of apples in their armpits and groins, oozing blood and pus, men consumed by a fever that twisted their minds before it stilled their hearts. The Sicilian authorities, in a spasm of belated wisdom, ordered the ghost ships out of their harbour. But it was too late. The Rat, that quiet, unassuming passenger of human commerce, had already disembarked. And on the Rat, the Flea. And in the Flea, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The great mortality had arrived in Europe. It moved with a speed that defied comprehension, a pace set not by armies, but by merchants and pilgrims, by the simple everyday rhythms of medieval life. From Messina, it slithered up the boot of Italy. It took Genoa and Venice, those great naval powers, with breathtaking ferocity. In Venice, a city built on water and trade, the canals soon choked with corpse-laden barges. The city's famous revelry fell silent. The masks of carnival were replaced by the blank stare of terror. By January of 1348, it was in Marseilles, carried by the same galleys that had poisoned Sicily. From there it bifurcated. One lethal tide flowed west into Spain. Another flowed north, up the Rhone Valley, into the heart of France. It reached Paris by the summer. The city, a crowded, unsanitary jewel of Gothic spires and timber-framed houses, became a death trap. The University of Paris, the greatest intellectual centre in Christendom, could offer no explanation. Its medical faculty, masters of Galenic theory, of the delicate balance of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, were powerless. They prescribed bleeding, purging, the application of hot poultices. They advised people to flee areas with bad air, to burn aromatic woods, to avoid bathing. Nothing worked. The plague was not a simple imbalance of humours. It was something new, something absolute. The world had known pestilence before. The chronicles were full of them. But this was different. This was not a sickness that culled the weak, the old, the very young. It took everyone. It took strapping young men in the morning and laid them in a grave by evening. It took mothers from their children, priests from their pulpits. Agnolo di Tura, a Sienese chronicler, wrote of the devastation in his city, a personal testimony that chills the blood across 7 centuries. He spoke of digging pits so deep they had to be layered with bodies like lasagna with cheese. And he wrote, with a hand that must have trembled, "And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands." This was the essence of the Black Death. It shattered the most fundamental bonds of human society. Fathers abandoned sick sons. Wives fled dying husbands. The living, wrote Boccaccio in Florence, scarcely had time to mourn the dead, let alone bury them with dignity. The rituals that gave life meaning, confession, last rites, a proper burial, evaporated. Priests, often the first to minister to the sick, died in such numbers that the terrified laity were left to face eternity alone. The sound of the death cart's bell became the new rhythm of urban life. The cry of "Bring out your dead," the new liturgy. In the face of this utter annihilation, the old structures crumbled. the medical profession, a proud and learned class, was exposed as utterly impotent. A doctor in his fine robes could stand at a bedside, gaze at a urine flask, mutter about the stars and the alignment of the planets, and charge a handsome fee for the privilege of watching a patient die. Their cures were theatrical nonsense. Ground unicorn horn, crushed emeralds, arsenic mercury. Many simply fled. They packed their bags, saddled their horses, and rode for their country estates, leaving the cities to fester. Who could blame them? To stay was to die, but their flight created a vacuum, a terrifying void in the fabric of a society that was literally bleeding out. The city was a patient, and its doctors had abandoned it. There was no one to tend to the sick, no one to offer comfort, no one to even attempt a cure, however useless. And most critically, from the perspective of the terrified city councils and magistrates who remained, there was no one to count the dead, no one to keep the records, to track the disease's progress, to officially declare a house sealed, or a body ready for the pit. The administration of death, a grim but necessary bureaucracy, had collapsed. And it was out of this perfect storm of mass death, medical failure, and civic desperation that a new figure was conceived. A professional born not of prestige or learning, but of sheer, brutal necessity. The world needed someone, anyone, willing to walk into the dying houses. And so, in the smoking ruins of the mid-14th century, the cities of Europe began to write a new kind of contract. The plague did not vanish after its first horrific sweep. That was perhaps its cruelest trick. It receded, leaving a traumatized, depopulated continent in its wake. But it did not leave for good. It became a recurring nightmare, an endemic terror that would return every 10 or 20 years for the next 3 centuries, a phantom that haunted the European imagination. Each new outbreak was a painful reminder of society's fragility, and so the cities, particularly the well-organised and wealthy city-states of Italy, began to innovate. They developed the first public health measures in history. They created quarantine laws, maritime inspection stations, and health boards, magistracies of sanitation, and they began to hire a new kind of public servant, the medico della peste, the plague doctor. This was not the iconic beaked figure of popular culture. Not yet. That was a much later invention. The first plague doctors of the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries were far more mundane and far more interesting. They were in essence municipal contractors, hired guns against an invisible enemy. A town facing an outbreak would draw up a formal contract, a remarkable document detailing the doctor's duties, his salary and his limitations. The salary was the first and most important part of the equation. It was extraordinarily high. A plague doctor could earn 4, 5, even 10 times what a normal physician made. It was hazard pay of the most extreme kind. This enormous sum was meant to entice someone to take on a job that was almost certainly a death sentence. It was a golden handshake with the Grim Reaper. But who would take such a job? Rarely the best and the brightest. The most successful physicians, with their wealthy private clientele, had no reason to risk their lives in the plague-choked slums. The civic plague doctor was often a second-tier professional. He might be a young doctor, ambitious and desperate to make a name for himself, seeing the plague as a grim but rapid ladder to prominence and wealth. Or he might be an older doctor whose practice had failed, with nothing left to lose. Some weren't even fully trained doctors. They were surgeons, who were considered a lower class of practitioner, or even empirics, with no formal training at all. In some cases, towns became so desperate they would hire a charlatan, a conman, anyone willing to put on a brave face and walk the streets. The contract was their only credential. The terms of these contracts were brutally specific. The doctor was required to treat all plague victims within the city walls, regardless of their station. Rich or poor, merchant or beggar, he had to answer the call. This was a radical departure from the standard medical practice of the day, which was entirely fee-for-service and catered almost exclusively to the wealthy. The plague doctor was a public utility, Like a well-digger or a watchman, he was forbidden from entering into normal social contact. He often had to live in a designated house, sometimes isolated, to prevent him from becoming a vector of the very disease he was fighting. He was forbidden from engaging in any other medical practice during his contract, to ensure his focus was solely on the plague. He became a kind of secular pariah, a man set apart. People would see him coming down the street in his plain dark robes, and they would cross to the other side, not necessarily out of malice, but out of a primal, superstitious fear. He was the man who walked with death. His medical duties were, by our standards, a catalogue of futility. His primary tool was the lancet, following the ancient belief that the plague's buboes, the swollen lymph nodes, contained the poison of the disease. He would lance them. This was an excruciatingly painful procedure, often done without any form of anaesthetic, and it was medically disastrous. Opening a bubo on a septicemic patient frequently introduced secondary infections, hastening death. But it was something. It was an action, a visible intervention in a situation that felt utterly hopeless. He might also apply poultices made of figs and cooked onions, or place dried toads and leeches on the buboes, believing they would draw out the pestilence. He prescribed potions and cordials, complex mixtures of herbs, spices, and precious minerals, which did little more than hydrate or poison the patient. But his most important function was not medical. It was bureaucratic. The plague doctor was the city's eyes and ears on the ground. He was a data collector. His contract required him to keep careful records: who was sick, where they lived, who had died. He was often the official who would authorize a house to be sealed, with the sick and the healthy alike trapped inside for 40 days, the 40 giorni that gives us our word quarantine. He performed autopsies not for scientific research in the modern sense, but as a legal requirement, to confirm that a death was indeed from the plague and not some other cause. This was vital for matters of inheritance and public records. He was in a very real sense an agent of the state. He was there to manage the crisis, to maintain a semblance of order amidst the chaos. The cure was secondary. Containment and disinformation were paramount. He advised the public health boards, telling them which neighbourhoods were hardest hit, helping them to draw lines on a map, cordoning off the infection. He was fighting a war not with medicine, but with logistics. And in this brutal administrative role, these first civic doctors laid the groundwork for the entire field of public health. They were the lonely, underqualified and terrified pioneers of epidemiology, counting the dead in one town after another, generation after generation, while the plague waxed and waned like a deadly tide. For over 250 years they walked into the darkness, armed with little more than a contract, a knife and a ledger. Then in the 17th century someone decided they needed armour. The change did not come from a public health board or a city council. It came from the rarefied world of royal medicine. The year is 1619. The plague is once again ravaging Europe, and in Paris a physician named Charles Delorme, a man of considerable influence and prestige, considers the problem of self-preservation. Delorme was no second-rate civic hireling. He was the chief physician to 3 French kings, Henri IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV. He lived to be 94 years old, an astonishing feat in his era, which suggests a man who took his own health very seriously. He was at the cutting edge of 17th century medical theory, a theory dominated by one powerful, pervasive and entirely incorrect idea, the miasma. The word comes from the Greek for pollution, and the theory held that diseases like the plague, cholera and chlamydia were spread not by contact with the sick, nor by microorganisms too small to see, but by a form of bad air. This pestilential air, it was thought, arose from rotting organic matter, from swamps, from corpses, from the exhalations of the sick. It was a poisonous vapour, a noxious cloud that could be detected by its foul smell. To prevent disease, one had to avoid breathing in the miasma. This theory, while wrong, was not illogical. It was based on empirical observation. Sickness was often associated with filth and bad smells. The slums, the battlefields, the marshlands, these were the places where disease flourished. It was a natural conclusion to link the stench with the sickness. And so, all efforts at prevention were focused on purifying the air. People burned juniper and rosemary in their homes. They carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with fragrant herbs and spices, which they held to their noses when walking through the streets. Delorme's innovation was to take this principle and apply it to the physician himself. He reasoned that if a doctor was to walk through plague-infested streets and enter the putrid rooms of the dying, he needed more than a handful of herbs. He needed a personal, portable air filtration system. He needed a full-body shield against the invisible miasma. And so he designed an outfit, a head-to-toe apparatus of such strange and terrifying appearance that it would burn itself into the Western psyche forever. He designed the beak. The centerpiece of the costume was the mask. It was made of leather and shaped into the face of a bird with a long, hollow beak that extended a half-foot or more from the physician's nose. This was not for theatrical effect. The beak was the respirator. It was packed with a potent blend of aromatic substances known as theriac. The recipe for theriac varied, but it could contain over 55 different ingredients, including cinnamon, myrrh, honey, and, quite often, viper's flesh and opium. The powerful scent of these herbs was believed to neutralize the miasma before it could be inhaled. The doctor would breathe only this purified, medicated air, a personal atmosphere of protective fragrance. The mask had 2 small eye holes, covered with round glass spectacles, sealing the eyes away from the bad air. The effect was profoundly unsettling. A creature with a human body and the impassive, glassy-eyed head of a monstrous bird. The rest of the suit was an extension of this same protective principle. The doctor wore a long coat, reaching from his neck to his ankles, made of heavy canvas or goatskin leather. This garment was thoroughly coated in hardened suet or wax. The idea was that the smooth, repellent surface would prevent the miasma from clinging to the fabric. Any poisonous vapours would simply slide off. Beneath the coat he wore leather breeches tucked into tall leather boots, and leather gloves covered his hands. A wide-brimmed leather hat, of the kind often worn by physicians of the day, completed the ensemble, but it served a practical purpose too. It was another layer of protection, and it helped to signify his professional status. The entire body was sealed within a fortress of waxed cloth and leather. In his gloved hand he carried a long wooden cane, or staff. This was a crucial multi-purpose tool. It allowed him to examine patients from a distance, lifting their bedclothes or pointing to the location of their buboes without making physical contact. It was a tool of social distancing, a way to enforce a perimeter of safety around his own body. He could use it to push aside the desperate family members who might crowd him, or even to defend himself from delirious or terrified patients. Most grimly, he used it to feel for a pulse, or to confirm that a patient lying still on a pallet was, in fact, deceased. The cane was his probe, his pointer, his weapon, and his badge of office. When fully assembled, the plague doctor was a truly alien sight. A slow-moving, black-clad figure, completely anonymous, his humanity erased by the leather mask and glass eyes. He did not look like a healer. He looked like a creature from a nightmare, a walking omen of death. The rustle of his waxed coat, the tap-tap-tap of his cane on the cobblestones, the strange bird-like silhouette moving through the smoke and fog of a plague-stricken city. It was a vision of profound dread, and yet this terrifying apparition was born of logic, of science as it was then understood. It was a 17th century hazmat suit. It was a piece of personal protective equipment, the most advanced that the age could produce. It was a monument to a flawed theory, a desperate technological attempt to conquer a foe that was still invisible, still misunderstood. The great irony is that the suit may have worked, but not for the reasons Delorme intended. The miasma theory was nonsense. The plague was spread by flea bites. The thick wax coat and leather garments would have provided an excellent barrier against fleas. The fleas that jumped from a patient or their bedding would have found it difficult to bite through the heavy treated material. So by a fortunate accident of wrong-headed science, the costume may have offered a degree of real protection. The doctor, sealed in his personal bubble of fragrant herbs, thinking he was fending off bad air, was in reality fending off insects. He was fighting the right war, but for all the wrong reasons. The birth of the beak marks a turning point in our story. It is the moment when the image crystallises, when the civic functionary of the Middle Ages puts on the mask of the early modern spectre. He is no longer just a man doing a dangerous job, he is now an icon, a symbol of pestilence itself, a figure of both terror and a strange scientific hope. He was the future walking through the past. The silhouette appears first, a slow, deliberate shape detaching itself from the twilight haze of a smoke-choked street. It is not the shape of a man, not truly. It is something other, something constructed. At its base is a long, heavy coat, a cloak that falls from shoulder to ankle without a break in its dark, forbidding line. It is made of leather, often from a goat or a sheep, and it is saturated with wax or suet. The surface gleams dully in the light of a passing torch, slick and impermeable. Every fold and crease is a deliberate defence, a calculated barrier. The logic, born of desperation and the best science of the age, was simple. Poison travels in the air, but it also clings to cloth, to the very fibres of a man's tunic. Wool would absorb the pestilence, linen would drink it in, but this waxed armour, this second skin would repel it. The miasma, the foul, deathly air, would slide from its surface like rainwater from a duck's back. So too would the other, more tangible dangers. The spit and blood of a coughing patient, the sudden, desperate lurch of a fevered hand, the foul fluids that wept from the bursting buboes, all would meet this smooth, unyielding wall of hardened hide. To wear it was to be encased, to be sealed away from the world you were meant to save. The heat inside must have been stifling, the air thick with the smell of treated leather and your own sweat. A personal, suffocating atmosphere that was nonetheless preferable to the one outside. Beneath this imposing mantle, the defences continued. The doctor's breeches were tucked tightly into tall leather boots, leaving no gap, no vulnerable inch of flesh. His hands, the very instruments of his trade, were swathed in thick leather gloves, identical to the cloak in material and purpose. He was a man made of leather, a walking testament to the fear of touch, the terror of transmission. Every seam was a potential weakness, every exposed patch of skin a death sentence. And so he sealed himself in piece by piece until the man within was almost entirely gone, replaced by the uniform. This was not just clothing, it was a piece of medical technology, a personal quarantine chamber on legs. Crowning the figure was a hat, a wide-brimmed black leather hat, a style commonly worn by physicians of the era. It was a small, almost mundane concession to professional identity in an otherwise monstrous costume. It declared, "I am a doctor." It was a symbol of authority, a signifier that this creature, this bird-like apparition, was here on official business, sanctioned by the city magistrate or a wealthy patron. It was a sign of hope for some, a herald of doom for most, but it also served a practical purpose, offering a small shield from the airborne effluvia, the spatter from a second-story window, the unseen dangers that rain down in a plague-stricken city. The uniform was a complete system, a head-to-toe philosophy of prevention, and in one gloved hand he held his final and perhaps most important tool, a long, slender-taken wooden cane. This was not a walking stick. It was an extension of the doctor's will, a way to interact with the world without making contact. With this wand, he could lift the soiled bedclothes from a patient without touching the fabric. He could point to the swollen, blackened lymph nodes on a sufferer's neck or groin, indicating to an assistant where the lancet should fall. He could tap a body to check for signs of life, a grim but necessary percussion. He could even use it to take a patient's pulse, pressing one end to the wrist and feeling for a faint vibration through the wood. And in the darkest corners of a desperate city, it was a weapon. It could be used to push back the frantic, pleading crowds who saw him not as a healer, but as their only hope, or their last resort. their rage and fear boiling over into violence. The cane was a tool of examination, a symbol of distance and a means of self-preservation. It was the final piece of the armour, completing the transformation of a physician into something utterly alien. He was now a spectre of medicine, a walking fortress against a disease he could not see, could not understand, but could smell on every street corner. And it was that smell, that pervasive, terrifying stench, that dictated the design of the costume's most iconic and horrifying feature. The mask is what we remember. It is the hollow, haunting face of the plague. A long, bird-like beak, perhaps half a foot in length, jutting out from where a human nose and mouth should be. 2 round glass eyepieces, like the unblinking stare of an enormous insect, were set above it. The entire contraption was fashioned from the same leather as the rest of the uniform, secured to the head with straps, its edges tucked tightly into the collar of the cloak, completing the seal. The effect was immediate and profound. It stripped the wearer of all humanity. There was no expression to be read, no comforting smile, no flicker of empathy in the eyes. There was only this smooth, dark facade, this avian monstrosity that seemed to have stalked out of a fever dream. And yet this terrifying creation was born not of a desire to frighten, but from the most advanced medical theory of its day, the doctrine of miasma. For centuries, from the time of the ancient Greeks right through the 17th century and beyond, the prevailing scientific consensus was that disease, particularly epidemic disease like the plague, was not spread by physical contact or tiny living organisms. It was spread by miasma, a noxious vapour, a form of bad air. This poison was believed to rise from decaying organic matter, from swamps, from open graves, from the filth in the streets, and most potently, from the corrupted bodies of the sick and the dead. Sickness was a smell. The stench of death was not just a symptom of the plague. It was its very essence, its mode of transmission. If you could smell it, you could be infected by it. The air itself had become the enemy. This theory, while utterly wrong about the mechanism of transmission, the flea-infested rats carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium was not entirely without certain grim logic. Plague-stricken cities did reek of death and decay. The foulest-smelling, most unsanitary districts were often the hardest hit. The correlation was clear, even if the causation was misunderstood. And so, the primary goal of any preventative measure was to purify the air, or to create a barrier against it. The plague doctor's mask was the ultimate personal air filter, a wearable fumigation device. The beak was not an aesthetic choice. It was a functional reservoir, a hollow space designed to be filled with aromatic substances. It was a portable garden of scents, a small pocket of fragrant, good air for the doctor to breathe while surrounded by the bad air of the pestilence. Inside that long lay the snout. A carefully curated potpourri of protective herbs and spices was packed. The precise recipe varied from doctor to doctor, a signature blend of sweet and pungent aromas intended to overpower and neutralize the deadly miasma. There would be pungent camphor, a waxy, white, crystalline substance with a smell that could clear the sinuses, and, it was hoped, the air. There were dried flowers, rose and carnation petals, their delicate sweetness a stark contrast to the world outside the mask. There were herbs like mint and cloves, sharp and spicy. There was storax, a resin from a tree that burned with a perfume-like smoke, and laudanum, a tincture of opium, which may have served to dull the doctor's senses not only to the smells, but to the sheer horror of his daily work. Often the blend would be held together by a sponge soaked in vinegar or sweet oil, and sometimes, for the doctor who could afford it or who subscribed to the most potent of remedies, the beak would contain a measure of theriac. Theriac was the superstar pharmaceutical of the pre-modern world, a complex medicinal paste whose origins stretched back to ancient Rome. Its recipe was a closely guarded secret, but it was known to contain dozens, sometimes over 60 ingredients. It was a honey-based concoction that included cinnamon, myrrh, and rare spices, but also more esoteric components like crushed minerals, and most famously the flesh of vipers. It was considered a universal antidote, a cure-all for poison, venom, and disease. A small amount stuffed into the tip of the beak was the ultimate guarantee of safety, a dose of the most powerful medicine in the world, filtering every breath the doctor took. Imagine for a moment being that doctor. Sealed in leather, vision constricted by the two small glass circles, the world outside muted and distorted. The only sounds are the creak of your own uniform and the muffled cries of the dying. But the smell is your own. You are breathing a thick, cloying atmosphere of roses and camphor, of vinegar and cloves. It is a powerful, almost sickening perfume, but it is your perfume. It is the smell of safety. It is the sweet scent of your survival, a fragrant shield against the stench of death that you know waits just on the other side of your leather beak. The mask was a psychological fortress as much as a physical one. It created a bubble of personal space, of controlled sensation, in a world that had descended into chaos. It allowed the doctor to move through the valley of death, breathing his own air, convinced of his own protection, while appearing to the world as death itself. But once he reached the patient's bedside, protected by his terrifying armour and his private atmosphere, what could he actually do? What cures did this fearsome birdman carry in his bag? The doctor, now standing over the sickbed, was a figure of profound contradiction. His very presence was a monument to the theory of airborne disease, yet the treatments he was about to administer were based on an entirely different and far more ancient medical philosophy, the theory of the four humours. This was the bedrock of Western medicine for 2,000 years, a legacy of Hippocrates and Galen. It held that the human body was composed of four essential fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four humours in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was simply an imbalance, a surplus or a deficiency of one of these vital liquids. The plague, with its high fevers, was clearly a disease of excess heat and moisture, a surfeit of blood. The physician's task, then, was not to kill an invading organism he could not imagine, but to restore the patient's natural equilibrium. His methods were brutal, misguided, and often more deadly than the disease itself. The most common and direct intervention was bloodletting. The logic was inescapable, If the body had too much blood, the solution was to remove some. The doctor would produce a small, sharp knife called a lancet. He would search for a prominent vein in the patient's arm or neck, and with a swift, practised motion, make an incision. The blood, dark and sluggish, would be collected in a bowl, its quantity measured with a grim precision. How much to take? That was the art of it. Too little, and the imbalance would remain. Too much, and the patient might expire on the spot. Often the doctor would drain the patient until they fainted, believing this swoon to be a sign that the body's humours were rebalancing. For patients too weak for the lancet, or for ailments localised to a specific area, the doctor had another tool: leeches. These slick dark creatures, kept in a jar of water, would be applied to the skin. They would attach themselves with their suckers, inject an anticoagulant to keep the blood flowing, and drink their fill, swelling up like small black grapes before dropping off. The patient, already weakened by fever, dehydration, and the ravages of the bacteria, would now be further depleted by significant blood loss, their body's ability to fight the infection critically compromised. Then there were the buboes, the terrifying egg-sized swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, neck, and armpits that gave the bubonic plague its name. These were seen as the body's attempt to collect and expel the plague's poison. The doctor's role was to help this process along. He would take his lancet and lance the bubo, cutting deep into the swollen, inflamed tissue. The goal was to release the foul-smelling, blackish pus within. The procedure was excruciatingly painful, performed without anaesthetic on a patient already in agony. Once drained, the open wound would be treated. Sometimes it was cauterized with a hot iron to stop the bleeding and purify the flesh. Other times a poultice would be applied. These were strange concoctions, pastes made of things like fig, cooked onion, and butter, or more bizarrely, mixtures of tree resin and the roots of white lilies. One particularly grim cure involved applying a dried toad or the desiccated body of a pigeon to the bubo. It was believed that these creatures, through some sympathetic magic, would draw the poison out of the human body and into their own. The patient would lie there, bleeding from a vein, a gaping wound in their groin packed with onion paste, a dead bird strapped to their neck, as the doctor nodded with grim satisfaction, having done all that his science demanded. If these direct interventions failed, the doctor could turn to his pharmacopoeia, prescribing potions and pills of bewildering complexity and dubious effect. These were the plague waters and sovereign cordials sold by apothecaries at exorbitant prices. Some were harmless herbal infusions, many were not. Prescriptions might call for a powder of crushed emeralds, a literal consumption of wealth, on the theory that such a precious substance must have powerful properties. Others relied on potent poisons, operating on the principle that one poison might drive out another. Mercury and arsenic were common ingredients, administered in small, carefully measured doses that were nonetheless toxic. The famous theriac, the same compound used in the doctor's mask, was also eaten as a preventative or a cure. This viper and opium-laced treacle was swallowed by the spoonful, a desperate act of faith in an ancient formula. The doctor was not just a surgeon, he was an alchemist, mixing elixirs that promised life but often delivered a quicker death. Beyond the individual patient, the plague doctor's work extended to public health advice, all filtered through the lens of miasma. He would instruct households on how to fumigate their homes, to burn sweet-smelling woods like juniper and ash in every room. Barrels of tar or sulphur would be set alight in the streets, filling the city with an acrid smoke that was believed to cleanse the air. He would advise people on their diet, telling them to avoid foods that were too moist or hot, as this would contribute to the humoral imbalance that made one susceptible. He would tell them to carry their own personal anti-miasma devices, a pocket full of posies, as the nursery rhyme remembers, or a pomander, a small metal ball filled with ambergris or other perfumes, to be held to the nose when walking through a particularly foul-smelling part of town. His advice touched every part of life. He might warn citizens to stay indoors when the wind blew from the south, as it was thought to carry swampy, pestilential vapours. He would prescribe bathing but not in water, which was seen as suspect, but in vinegar or rosewater. And in a piece of advice that echoes eerily to our own time, he would tell people to cultivate a cheerful disposition. Fear, grief, and sadness were believed to weaken the body's constitution, making it a more welcoming vessel for the plague. To survive, you had to avoid bad air, bad food, and bad thoughts. It is easy for us, with our knowledge of germ theory, to look back on this catalogue of treatments as a grim carnival of quackery. And it was. The bloodletting weakened, the lancing invited secondary infections, the potions poisoned. Almost nothing the plague doctor did for a patient actually helped, and a great deal of it hurt. But it was not sadism, it was not malicious fraud, it was medicine. It was the logical, systematic application of the best scientific knowledge available at the time. These doctors were not fools, they were learned men, operating within a deeply flawed but internally consistent paradigm. They were fighting a monster in the dark with the only weapons they had. The tragedy is that their weapons were pointed in the wrong direction. Their paradigm was a phantom, and the monster they fought was a bacterium they could not even imagine. And so the terrifying figure in the beaked mask would move from one house to the next, leaving a trail of well-intentioned devastation in his wake, a symbol not of healing, but of the terrifying limits of human understanding in the face of annihilation. To be a plague doctor was to willingly step out of the world. It was an act of profound and terrifying separation, a contractual exile. The very agreement that granted a man his title and his salary also served as his social death warrant. He was no longer a citizen in the conventional sense. He was a municipal utility, a necessary tool. And like any tool used to handle something unclean, he was to be kept apart, stored away until needed. His life became a study in boundaries, both visible and invisible. The most obvious was his quarantine. A plague doctor did not go home to his family at the end of a long day. He had no home, not really. The city would designate a house for him, often on the very edge of the inhabited district, sometimes even outside the walls in a repurposed gatehouse, or a lonely cottage near the plague hospital, the lazaretto. This was not a residence. It was a holding cell. Food would be left for him at a distance, on a doorstep or a designated stone. Payment for any goods procured from a brave or desperate merchant was not made hand to hand. Coins would be dropped into a bowl of vinegar or strong wine, the acidic bath thought to cleanse the metal of the miasma, of the pestilential vapour that was believed to cling to every surface the doctor touched. He lived in a bubble of sterile air, a pocket of quiet dread. When he walked through the town, and he only walked when on official business, the streets would clear before him. He was a human bell, his presence heralding not a service but a sentence. Mothers would pull their children inside, merchants would shutter their windows, and men would cross to the far side of the street, sometimes making the sign of the cross or clutching a personal amulet as he passed. The sound of his own footsteps on the cobblestones, a solitary rhythmic beat in an otherwise silent lane, must have been a constant, maddening companion. He was the most visible man in the city, yet he was utterly alone. This isolation was not merely a social convention, it was legally enforced. His contract, a cold, pragmatic document, would explicitly forbid him from entering any public house, any market, any church for general worship. He was forbidden from conversing with healthy citizens on matters unrelated to the plague. He was, for the duration of his service, a ghost haunting his own city. Imagine the psychological toll. Every human instinct for comfort, for community, for a shared glance of understanding was denied. He was surrounded by death all day, listening to the confessions of the dying, watching families disintegrate in a matter of hours. And when his work was done, he returned not to the warmth of a family hearth, but to the cold silence of his isolated room. His only companions were his own thoughts, steeped in the suffering he had witnessed. He was a repository of the city's darkest secrets. He knew which noble house was lying about the health of its patriarch, which merchant had tried to bribe his way out of a quarantine. He saw the raw, unfiltered terror in the eyes of the powerful and the quiet, heart-breaking resignation in the eyes of the poor. But he could share none of it. This knowledge was a burden he carried in his solitude, a weight that pressed down in the quiet hours of the night. Did he become numb? Did he find solace in faith? Or did the sheer scale of the suffering he witnessed erode any belief in a benevolent God? The records are largely silent on the inner lives of these men. They speak of salaries and duties, of herbs and lancets, but not of the soul-crushing loneliness. We can only speculate about the quiet rituals that kept them sane. Perhaps it was the meticulous care of their equipment, the endless grinding of herbs for their pomanders, the careful waxing of their leather cloaks. In a world of chaos, perhaps these small controllable tasks provided a fragile anchor. Or perhaps, for some, the isolation was a strange kind of freedom. Stripped of all social obligations and niceties, they were reduced to their singular grim purpose. They were no longer a son, a husband, or a friend. They were simply il medico della peste, the doctor of the plague. Their identity was their uniform, their purpose their only companion. But this was a fragile defence against the encroaching silence. They were men who walked in a miasma of fear, both the theoretical one they fought and the very real one they generated. They were paid handsomely for their trouble, a premium for their risk and their sacrifice. But money is a cold comfort in an empty room, and a full purse cannot buy back the simple human touch it has cost you. They were figures of immense public importance and utter personal desolation, the living embodiment of the city's desperate bargain with death. And in that lonely liminal space they waited for the next summons. The next house with a cross painted on the door. The next soul to commend to God or to the earth. While the archetype of the isolated, anonymous doctor is powerful, these were, of course, real men. Their names may have been whispered in fear on the streets, but they were carefully inscribed in the precise bureaucratic ledgers of city councils, and by examining these records, we can pull a few individuals out of the anonymous gloom and see the human face behind the mask. Let us consider one such man, Giovanni da Ventura, who in the year 1479 signed a contract with the city of Turin in northern Italy. His contract is a remarkable document, not for its heroism, but for its stark, unsentimental pragmatism. It is a business agreement for a hazardous job. Giovanni was not a distinguished physician from a grand university. He was, most likely, a second or third-tier practitioner, a man willing to take a risk others were not. This was common. The most established and successful doctors of a city had wealthy patrons to protect and flourishing practices to maintain. They would not abandon them for the charnel house. The municipal plague doctor was a role for the ambitious, the desperate, or the foreign. Giovanni's contract stipulated a salary of 30 florins a month. This was a very handsome sum, far more than a skilled artisan or even a university-educated professional might earn. It was a clear acknowledgement of the extreme personal risk involved. But the payment came with strict conditions, the very same ones that enforced the isolation we have just discussed. He was forbidden from entering the city proper without a specific summons from a municipal agent. He was not to have social intercourse with any person in the city, a clause that legally mandated his loneliness. The city of Turin was not just hiring a doctor, it was leasing a man's life, fencing him off from the rest of humanity for the duration of the outbreak. The contract also reveals the city's long-term thinking. In addition to his salary, Giovanni da Ventura was promised a significant bonus upon the successful conclusion of his contract. Full citizenship in the city of Turin. This was a powerful incentive. Citizenship conferred legal rights, trading privileges, and a permanent place in the community. It was a golden prize dangled before him, the promise of a life after the plague, a chance to rejoin the world he had been forced to leave. It was a gamble. If he survived, his future was secured. If he did not, the city owed him nothing more. The contract is a chillingly clear-eyed calculation of risk and reward, made by both the doctor and his employers. But what of the most famous plague doctor of all, the great seer and physician Nostradamus? The image is a potent one, the prophet of doom cloaked in black, his beaked mask a familiar silhouette, striding through the plague-stricken towns of 16th century France. It is an image that has graced countless books and documentaries, and it is almost entirely false. Michel de Nostradam was indeed a physician, or, more accurately, an apothecary. He did travel and treat plague victims during a severe outbreak in Provence around the 1540s. He was known for his innovative, if unproven, treatments such as his rose pills, a lozenge made of rose hips, rich in vitamin C, which may have helped with scurvy but not the plague, and he was a fierce advocate for sanitation, urging the removal of infected corpses and the importance of fresh air and clean water. His methods, which rejected the common and dangerous practice of bloodletting, were certainly progressive for his time. But he never wore the beaked mask. He never donned the famous costume. Why? Because it had not been invented yet. The iconic plague doctor uniform, the one that defines the entire image, was developed more than half a century after Nostradamus' death. It was the creation of a French physician named Charles Delorme in the early 17th century, first appearing in a major way during the plague of 1619 in Paris, and gaining widespread notice during the devastating Naples outbreak of 1656. Nostradamus died in 1566. The timelines simply do not match. The popular association is a romantic conflation, a historical fiction born from the desire to connect two of the era's most mysterious and compelling figures, the prophet who saw the future and the doctor who walked with death. The reality is that Nostradamus' fight against the plague was conducted in the ordinary clothes of a 16th century physician, armed not with a beaked mask, but with his knowledge of herbal remedies and a belief in hygiene that was far ahead of its time. The fate of most plague doctors, however, was not to be misremembered as a legend, but to be forgotten entirely. Their names appear once in a city ledger, hired, and then they vanish. The mortality rate for these frontline practitioners was catastrophically high. They were working in an era with no concept of germ theory, relying on a flawed understanding of miasma, or bad air, as the agent of transmission. While their waxed leather garments and herb-filled masks offered a surprising, if accidental, degree of protection against flea bites and respiratory droplets, it was far from foolproof. They were directly exposed day after day to the highest concentrations of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. They handled the sick, lanced their buboes, and were present in unventilated rooms where every surface and every breath was laden with contagion. For every Giovanni da Ventura who might have survived to claim his citizenship, there were dozens of others whose contracts were cut short by their own demise. Their final days were likely spent in the same lonely, isolated houses provided by the city. Their own symptoms, the fever, the swollen lymph nodes, the delirium, mirroring those of the countless patients they had treated. No colleague would come to tend to them. They were the end of the line. Their deaths would be recorded with the same dispassionate bureaucracy as their hiring, a line drawn through a name, a final payment left unclaimed. They were men who gambled their lives for a chance at a better future, but for so many the wager was lost. They remained footnotes in the municipal accounts, forgotten soldiers in a war they could not possibly win, their individual stories swallowed by the immensity of the pestilence they fought. They were not heroes in shining armour, but pragmatic men in dark cloaks, whose names and fates are, for the most part, lost to the indifferent silence of history. For all the cold, hard facts of their contracts and the historical reality of their work, this is not how the plague doctor lived in the mind of the common person. To the farmer, the baker, or the washerwoman, the doctor was not a municipal employee or a medical practitioner. He was a symbol. He was a walking, breathing omen. His appearance in your street at your door was not a sign of hope or healing. It was the confirmation of your worst fear. It was the official seal of death's arrival. The sight of the beaked figure, a dark avian silhouette against the grimy backdrop of a plague-ridden city, did not bring comfort. It brought terror. His arrival meant that the whispers were true. The plague was here. His knock on the door, often made with the end of his long pointing stick to maintain distance, was a sound more final than a judge's gavel. It signified the beginning of the end. Once the doctor confirmed the diagnosis, the machinery of public health, such as it was, would grind into motion. A red or black cross would be painted on your door. A guard would be posted outside. The house would be sealed, a cordon sanitaire, drawn around your family, trapping the sick and the healthy together in a tomb of their own making. The doctor's visit was the key turning in the lock. He was not seen as a saviour trying to rescue those within, but as the harbinger who condemned them all. This perception is etched into the art and folklore of the period. In Commedia dell'arte, the Italian street theatre tradition, a stock character emerged, Il Medico della Peste. This was not a heroic figure. He was a caricature, often portrayed as a doddering old fool, a charlatan who spoke in nonsensical Latin and prescribed ridiculous, expensive cures. He was an object of mockery, a way for the public to process their fear and powerlessness by laughing at the very figure who represented it. He was a quack, a profiteer who grew rich on the suffering of others. This portrayal, while comedic, reflected a deep-seated public cynicism. People knew on some level that the doctor's cures, the potions of ground unicorn horn, the application of live chickens to draw out the poison, were useless. He was part of a grim, expensive ritual that almost always ended in death. In the darker, more serious art of the era, the plague doctor takes on a more sinister form. Consider the famous 17th century engraving by Paul Fürst of Nuremberg, titled Dr. Schnabel von Rom, Dr. Beak from Rome. This image, perhaps more than any other, cemented the plague doctor in the popular imagination. The doctor is shown in full terrifying regalia, the wide-brimmed hat, the glassy-eyed mask with its long bird-like beak, the floor-length leather coat, and the pointing staff. He looks less like a man and more like a creature from a nightmare, a bizarre mythological bird god of pestilence. He is utterly inhuman. The accompanying text, a poem, describes his function: to visit the dead and the dying, to receive his payment, and to leave. It does not speak of healing, it speaks of a transaction with death. This was not a portrait of a healer, it was the personification of the plague itself. He became conflated with the Grim Reaper, another skeletal figure who walked the land with a tool of his trade. One carried a scythe, the other a pointing stick. Superstition swirled around him like the miasmic vapours he was meant to ward off. His gaze, seen through the crystal eyepieces of his mask, was thought to be unlucky, perhaps even capable of transmitting the disease. To have his shadow fall upon you was a terrible omen. The herbs that billowed from his beak, camphor, mint, cloves, myrrh, were meant to purify the air. But to the public, it was the smell of death's approach. It was a potent, cloying scent that would forever be associated with the final agonizing hours of a loved one. The Doctor moved through a world of folklore he had unwittingly helped to create. He was the bogeyman made real, a figure used to frighten children and a source of dread for adults. This perception was not entirely baseless paranoia. The line between a municipal doctor and an opportunistic predator was often perilously thin. Some of these men did indeed exploit the terror of the populace for personal gain. Records from various outbreaks include accusations of doctors charging exorbitant fees from desperate families for bogus plague-proof amulets or secret elixirs. There were tales of doctors who would falsely declare a wealthy person sick in order to gain access to their home, either to loot it themselves or to work in concert with thieves. They might be accused of hastening the death of a patient to collect a promised inheritance. In a time of social collapse when law and order were strained to the breaking point, the plague doctor operated in a grey area of immense power and little oversight. He had the authority to condemn a house to quarantine, a decision that could mean financial ruin or starvation for its inhabitants. Whether driven by greed, cynicism, or simple desperation, the potential for abuse was enormous, and the public knew it. So when the common person saw that strange cloaked figure moving down their street, they saw a multitude of dreadful possibilities. They saw the harbinger of a quarantine that would trap them with the sick. They saw a quack who would take their last coin for a useless cure. They saw a ghoul who might be picking through their neighbour's possessions even before the body was cold. And at the most primal level they saw a living ghost, a man who walked so freely among the dead and dying that he no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. He was a terrifying anomaly, a necessary evil at best. He was the face the city put on the plague, and it was a face from a waking nightmare, a smooth leather and glass visage with the beak of a carrion bird come to preside over the inevitable. He was not the hero of the story, he was the dark ferryman, paid to guide the endless stream of souls across the river of sickness to the shores of death. The end of the Plague Doctor was not a sudden event. It was not a grand finale marked by the vanquishing of the final pestilence. There was no treaty signed with the bacterium, no triumphant parade. Instead, the figure in the beaked mask faded away slowly, quietly, not because the plague was gone, but because the world of ideas in which he made sense had crumbled to dust. His existence was predicated on a single elegant and profoundly wrong concept: the miasma, the bad air. For centuries this was the great unifying theory of disease. Illness, it was believed, was carried on the wind, rising from rot and decay, an invisible fog of pestilence that could be smelled, and therefore fought with better smells. The entire uniform, from the fragrant herbs stuffed in the beak to the waxed canvas cloak meant to repel the corrupted air, was a fortress built against a phantom. The Doctor was an atmospheric warrior, his enemy an evil exhalation, and for a very long time, in the absence of a better explanation, this was the peak of medical reason. But ideas, like empires, eventually fall. The first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt long before anyone recognised them. As far back as 1546, a physician in Verona named Girolamo Fracastoro wrote a truly remarkable book, De Contagione, In it, he proposed that diseases were not caused by foul air, but by tiny, imperceptible particles, which he called seminaria, the seeds of contagion. He theorized that these seeds could pass from person to person, through direct contact, through contaminated objects, or even over a distance. He was, in essence, describing germs 300 years before they would be seen, but his words were a candle flame in a hurricane. They flickered and died out, lost in the overwhelming, odour-obsessed consensus of miasmatic theory. The world was not yet ready to believe that its greatest enemies were things it could not see, hear, or smell. It was far more comforting to blame a swamp than an invisible killer lurking on a handshake. The fortress of miasma began to show serious cracks in the 19th century, not in the grand hospitals of Paris or London, but in a field of disease silkworms in Italy. In the 1830s, an amateur naturalist named Agostino Bassi took up his microscope and, with painstaking diligence, proved that a fungal microorganism was the sole cause of a disease ravaging the local silk industry. He showed that it could be transmitted from sick worms to healthy ones. It was a revelation, a specific living thing causing a specific illness. This was not bad air. This was a microscopic predator. Bassi's discovery was a quiet shot, but it was heard across the scientific community. The ground was shifting. Then came a desperate man in a Vienna maternity ward. In the 1840s, the Hungarian doctor Ignaz Semmelweis was tormented by the high rates of childbed fever killing new mothers in his hospital. He noticed a grim pattern. Women in the ward, attended by doctors and medical students who came directly from performing autopsies, died at a terrifyingly high rate. Women in the ward attended only by midwives who did not handle cadavers were far safer. Semmelweis didn't know about bacteria, not yet. He theorized about cadaverous particles being transferred on the hands of the physicians. His solution was radical, and to his colleagues deeply insulting. He insisted that doctors wash their hands in a chlorine solution between the morgue and the delivery room. The results were immediate and astonishing. The death rate plummeted. He had saved countless lives, and for this he was ridiculed, professionally destroyed and driven from Vienna. His colleagues, the esteemed men of medicine, could not accept the notion that their own hands, the hands of gentlemen, were the instruments of death. It was an offence to their dignity. It was easier to believe in a vague, impersonal miasma than in their own contamination. Semmelweis died years later in an asylum, a martyr to an idea whose time had not quite come. The final decisive blows were struck by two titans of the new science, Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. Pasteur, a chemist, was a showman of science. With his elegant swan-neck flask experiments, he demolished the ancient idea of spontaneous generation, the belief that life, like maggots from meat, could simply arise from non-living matter. He proved that the microorganisms that caused fermentation and decay came from other microorganisms floating in the air. They were not the result of rot, they were the cause of it. From there, it was a short leap to disease. He developed pasteurization to kill these microbes in a milk and wine, and went on to create vaccines for anthrax and rabies. He gave the enemy a name and a face seen through the lens of a microscope. He called them germs. While Pasteur painted with a broad brush, Robert Koch was a master of meticulous detail. A quiet, methodical country doctor, Koch developed the techniques to isolate and grow pure cultures of bacteria. He created a set of rigorous rules, Koch's postulates, to prove beyond any doubt that a specific microbe caused a specific disease. You had to find the microbe in every case of the disease, isolate it, grow it in a lab, introduce it into a healthy host and watch it cause the same disease all over again. It was the scientific method as a weapon. He used it to identify the bacteria responsible for anthrax, for tuberculosis, and for cholera. The old world of medicine was officially over. The miasma was dead, and with it died the plague doctor. His entire purpose was invalidated. The beak, once a sophisticated filter, was now just a hollow leather cone, its potpourri of ambergris and mint a pathetic defence against an enemy that measured in micrometers. The waxed cloak, meant to be impermeable to bad air, was a porous, contaminated surface, a perfect vehicle for the very germs it was meant to repel. The wand, used to examine patients from a safe miasmatic distance, was useless when the true danger lay on the patient's skin, in their breath, on the very bed sheets. The new battlefield was microscopic. The new weapons were carbolic acid, sterile instruments and vaccines. The new doctor wore a clean white coat and wielded a microscope, not a staff. The iconic figure of the beaked physician was now a relic, a monument to a superseded science. He looked, to the newly enlightened eyes of the late 19th century, like a costumed shaman, a practitioner of elaborate, well-meaning but ultimately useless magic. When the Third Plague pandemic began to spread from China in the 1890s, the world turned not to men in bird masks, but to bacteriologists like Alexandra Yersin, who travelled to Hong Kong, isolated the Bacillus Yersinia pestis under his microscope, and finally, definitively, identified the plague's true cause. The plague doctor had not been a contagion fighter, he had been a ghost hunter, and the ghost was never real. His era was over, the uniform was put away, but it would not be forgotten. It was far too strange, too striking to simply disappear. As the genuine plague doctor vanished from the fever wards and quarantine islands of Europe, his costume, now an empty shell of a dead medical theory, began a second, truly bizarre life. The spectre of death, shed by the world of medicine, was about to be reborn in the world of entertainment. It found its new home on the sun-drenched piazzas and makeshift wooden stages of Italy, in the wild, anarchic, and hugely popular street theatre known as the Commedia dell'arte. This was the People's Theatre, a vibrant, improvisational art form that flourished from the 16th to the 18th centuries. It was built on a cast of stock characters, archetypes that the audience knew and loved. There was the wily servant Arlecchino, the braggart soldier Il Capitano, the grasping old merchant Pantalone, and the beautiful, clever maidservant Columbina. Into this raucous family of clowns, lovers and fools stepped a new, sinister figure, Il Medico della Peste, the doctor of the plague. The transformation was seamless, almost inevitable. The costume was simply too theatrical to be left in a dusty closet of medical history. The long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the white gloves, and of course the terrifying otherworldly beaked mask. It was a ready-made character design. On the commedia stage, the doctor was typically one of the vecchi, the old men, a category of characters meant to be mocked and outwitted. He was a caricature of the physicians of the day, a pompous, know-it-all quack whose supposed wisdom was a torrent of nonsensical jargon, a mix of bad Latin and invented medical terms. He would diagnose a simple case of lovesickness as a catastrophic failure of the humours, prescribing absurd and expensive treatments like ground unicorn horn or a poultice made of raven feathers. His long staff, once a tool for maintaining a safe distance from the infected, became a comedic prop, used for gesticulating wildly, poking other characters or tripping over at inopportune moments. The mask, in particular, was a gift to the comedic actor. In the real world, its blank, crystal-eyed gaze and bird-like profile were meant to be functional, projecting an air of detached, scientific authority while protecting the wearer. On stage, that same detachment became arrogance. The mask's rigid, unreadable expression was the perfect facade for a complete fraud. It hid the actor's face, allowing him to become a pure symbol of misplaced intellectual pride. The beak, no longer stuffed with therapeutic herbs, now amplified the doctor's booming, nonsensical pronouncements, turning his voice into an inhuman squawk. He became less a man and more a walking, talking embodiment of medical hubris. The audience, who had all experienced the often baffling and ineffective medicine of the era, roared with laughter. They were laughing at the character on stage, but they were also laughing at the fear and helplessness they felt in the face of real disease and the often powerless doctors who claimed they could fight it. This transformation was especially profound in Venice. The city of canals, a global crossroads of trade, was also a frequent and tragic victim of the plague. The memory of pestilence was etched into the very stones of the city. But Venice was also the city of Carnival, the magnificent city-wide masquerade where, for a few weeks each year, all social conventions were suspended behind the anonymity of a mask. The Venetian mask-making tradition was ancient and sophisticated. There was the white ghostly bauta, worn by citizens and nobles alike, the alluring velvet moretta for women, the long-nosed zanny masks of the commedia servants, the plague doctor's mask, with its chilling historical resonance and its stark avian features, but perfectly into this surreal pantheon. It became a popular choice for carnival goers, a way of confronting the city's darkest historical trauma by turning it into a costume, a piece of macabre fun. Strolling through the Piazza San Marco during Carnival, you might see Il Medico della Peste, not as a figure of dread, but as part of the party. He would flirt badly with Colombina, get into a fake duel with Il Capitano, and offer a grimly funny prognosis to a drunken reveller. He was no longer a symbol of a desperate fight against disease. He was a character in a story, a dark jester in the court of public imagination. And this, perhaps more than anything, is what cemented the image of the plague doctor in European culture. For many generations, especially after the Great Plagues had receded into memory, their primary encounter with this figure was not in a quarantine ledger or a medical text, but on a stage or in the joyous chaos of a Venetian festival. The historical reality of the municipal physician, a tired civil servant doing a dangerous and often fatal job based on the best science he had, was overwritten by the much more entertaining fiction of the bumbling beak-nosed charlatan. The man was gone, but the mask, now infused with the spirit of satire and masquerade, had become immortal. It had successfully made the leap from a tool of medicine to a trope of theatre, and from there it was only a small step to its final, and perhaps most enduring incarnation, as a pure, potent symbol in the world of art. The journey of the plague doctor from the stage to the canvas and the printing press was a slow and fascinating process of distillation. The image, already charged with the memory of real-world terror and the dark humour of the theatre, began to shed its narrative context and become a free-floating icon of the macabre. Early on in the 17th century, the depictions were closer to a form of grim journalism. The most famous of these is a copperplate engraving from 1656 by a German publisher named Paul Fürst, titled Dr. Schnabel von Rom, Dr. Beak from Rome. It is an unsettling and iconic image. The doctor stands stiffly, almost inhumanly. He is rendered in full from the flat-topped hat, a marker of a physician, down to his leather boots. His face is entirely hidden by the grotesque bird mask with its round, goggle-like eyes. One gloved hand holds the long wand, pointing it forward as if to ward off an unseen threat. The other hand is tucked behind his back. The long dark robe completely obscures his form, making him seem like an empty vessel, a hollow man. The text accompanying engravings like this was often descriptive, explaining the supposed function of each piece of the uniform: the beak to hold perfumes against the pestilential air, the waxed coat to prevent miasma from clinging to it. These images were presented as factual documents, a glimpse into the strange but rational methods being employed against the plague in other lands. They were objects of morbid curiosity, early examples of disaster reporting. But as the real plague doctor became a historical artefact and the theatrical medico became a familiar trope, artists began to use the figure in a more symbolic way. He was no longer just a doctor in a specific uniform, he was becoming an allegory. He was slowly merging with an older, more powerful figure, the Grim Reaper. The traditional image of death as a skeleton with a scythe was a product of the medieval mind, a representation of the great raw biological equalizer. The plague doctor offered a new, more modern personification of death. This was death in the age of science, or at least the pretense of science. He was methodical, detached, and clinical. His black robes mirrored the reaper's shroud. His staff echoed the scythe. and his bird-like mask suggested a scavenger, a carrion bird circling the dying. He was death by procedure, death by diagnosis, death that came not with a wild swing of a blade but with a quiet, gloved touch and a hopeless prognosis. This symbolic weight grew heavier through the 18th and 19th centuries. The artists of the Romantic movement, with their fascination for the medieval, the Gothic, and the sublime horror of the past, found the plague doctor irresistible. In their paintings and sketches, he is rarely seen treating a patient. Instead, he stalks through empty, fog-shrouded city streets, a solitary figure silhouetted against a dying sun. He becomes a harbinger, a portent of doom. His presence alone signifies that the plague is near. The historical context, the municipal contracts, the miasma theory, the desperate herbal remedies, is stripped away. All that remains is the powerful, terrifying aesthetic. He is a shape, a silhouette of dread. In this evolution, the costume's original purpose becomes inverted. What was once designed out of a desperate desire to preserve life became an artistic shorthand for the absolute certainty of death. This transformation also turned the figure into a symbol of human folly. The beaked mask, once a proud emblem of the most advanced medical thinking, was now viewed through the lens of modern scientific knowledge. It became a symbol of ignorance masquerading as expertise, a monument to the staggering arrogance of trying to combat a microscopic foe with perfume and leather. The doctor in the mask was the ultimate tragic figure, a man who believed himself to be a bastion of reason and a shield for humanity, but was, in reality, little more than a scarecrow, helpless against the invisible storm. Artists used this to explore themes of futility, the limits of human knowledge, and the way we construct elaborate, useless rituals in the face of overwhelming chaos. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this symbolic legacy exploded. Freed entirely from its historical moorings, the Plague Doctor became a stock character in the visual library of the Gothic and the fantastic. He appears in films, in video games, on album covers, and in dark fantasy art, almost never as a physician. He is a necromancer, an alchemist dabbling in forbidden arts, a silent, monstrous henchman, or a supernatural entity. The beak is longer, more sinister. The black robes are more tattered and dramatic. The glowing eyes, once simple crystal lenses, now often burn with a malevolent, otherworldly light. The historical figure of the Doctor has been completely consumed by the symbol he accidentally created. He is no longer a man named Giovanni or Jean-Paul, a father and a husband who signed a dangerous contract for a decent wage in a plague-stricken city. He is now an archetype, a creature of the collective unconscious. This is the final strange legacy of the beaked uniform. It was born from a flawed but sincere attempt to understand and survive a terrifying reality. It was then transformed into a caricature, a figure of fun on a sunlit stage. And finally it was enshrined in art as a timeless emblem of death, pestilence, and the beautiful, terrifying darkness of the unknown. The costume outlived its function, the character outlived the historical man, and the symbol, in the end, became far more powerful and enduring than the reality it first sought to represent. The man in the mask is long gone, but his shadow, long and beaked, stretches across the centuries, a permanent resident in our darkest dreams and most haunting stories. The shadow of the Plague Doctor did not vanish with the last embers of the Great Plagues. It merely receded, waiting in the dusty archives of history, a bizarre footnote in the long, grim story of European pestilence. For centuries the figure was little more than a historical curiosity, an image found in aging medical texts or scholarly treatises on the Black Death and its later vicious cousins. It was a costume, a strange and largely failed piece of medical technology, an emblem of a specific time and a specific terror. But history has a peculiar way of breathing life back into its ghosts. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, this particular ghost did not just walk again. It strode onto the global stage, transformed. It became an icon. This resurrection was not a matter of academic rediscovery, but of a cultural appropriation and imaginative re-engineering. The figure's strange, compelling silhouette was simply too powerful to remain locked in the past. It began to appear at first on the fringes. In the burgeoning subculture of steampunk, the Plague Doctor found a natural and welcoming home. Here was a movement obsessed with a romanticised, alternate version of the past, a past of brass goggles, intricate clockwork, and steam-powered ingenuity. The Plague Doctor's aesthetic fit this world perfectly. The leather mask, the wax coat, the mysterious air. It resonated with a love for antiquated technology and a fascination with the darker side of the Victorian and pre-Victorian eras. Within steampunk, the Doctor was unmoored from his grim, often ineffective historical reality. He was no longer the municipal contractor counting the dead in a stench-filled Milanese slum. Instead, he became a hero, an anti-hero, an inventor. The beak of his mask was no longer just a pouch for sweet-smelling herbs based on a flawed understanding of miasma. It became a sophisticated filtration device, a respirator humming with the imagined clockwork mechanisms. The crystal eyepieces were now telescopic, or infused with arcane energies. The simple wooden cane used to examine patients without touching them became a multi-purpose tool, a weapon, a diagnostic device of impossible complexity. The steampunk Plague Doctor was a fantasy, a vision of what the historical figure could have been if the science of his day had been as advanced and as elegant as his costume was strange. He was a symbol not of failure, but of resilience and intellect against a backdrop of neo-Victorian squalor and intrigue. He was cool, and that coolness was the key to his modern ascendance. From the workshops and conventions of steampunk, the Doctor's image bled into a far larger and more influential medium, video games. Here, the figure could be animated, given a voice, and woven into intricate narratives that reached millions. Perhaps no single piece of media did more to cement the Plague Doctor in the modern consciousness than the Assassin's Creed series. In the sun-drenched, meticulously recreated cities of Renaissance Italy in Assassin's Creed II and Brotherhood, the player encounters the Dottore della Peste. He is not a background character, but a recurring enemy type. His appearance is a signal of danger. The game designers captured the visual essence perfectly. The black robes, the wide-brimmed hat, the stark white bird-like mask. But they weaponized him. In the game, his cane is forgotten, replaced by a formidable syringe filled with poison. He moves with an unsettling, gliding gait, his masked face betraying no emotion as he stalks the player through the crowded streets of Venice or Rome. By making the Plague Doctor an antagonist, the game solidified a new interpretation of the figure. He wasn't a healer. He was a bringer of death, a sinister agent of a corrupt regime. This portrayal, while historically inaccurate in its specifics, tapped into a deeper latent fear associated with the mask. It represents medicine twisted into something malevolent, a perversion of the healer's art. For a generation of gamers, this became the definitive version of the Plague Doctor, a silent, eerie killer, a beautiful and terrifying piece of character design. Other games explored different facets of the archetype. In the punishing gothic horror of Darkest Dungeon, the Plague Doctor is a playable character, a woman who stands as one of the few bulwarks against encroaching madness and cosmic evil. Her skills perfectly encapsulate the historical ambiguity of the profession. She can heal her companions, curing blight and bleeding with her poultices and salves. But she can also do immense harm, lobbing bombs filled with noxious gas and plague grenades at her monstrous foes. She is both a mender and a poisoner, a creature of science and shadow, using her knowledge of alchemy to both preserve and destroy. This duality, the Doctor as both cure and contagion, is a far more nuanced take, reflecting the historical reality that the Plague Doctor's work often blurred the line between helping the sick and simply managing the spread of death. The aesthetic also saturated games like her Bloodborne, a masterpiece of gothic horror set in the plague-ridden city of Jahannam. While the classic Plague Doctor costume does not appear in its entirety on a single character, Its DNA is everywhere. We see it in Eileen the Crow, a hunter of other hunters, who wears a feathered cloak and a beaked mask, her silhouette a direct homage. We see it in the gas masks of the Yarnamite hunters and the long coats of the Healing Church physicians. The entire game is a meditation on pestilence, on tainted blood, and on cures that are often worse than the disease, themes intrinsically linked to the historical plague doctor. The game's atmosphere is thick with the same dread that would have permeated Marseille in 1720, a sense that the world itself is sick, and that those who claim to have the cure are the most dangerous of all. This fusion of unsettling aesthetics and sinister purpose made the Plague Doctor a natural star in the wider world of horror. The mask itself is a work of accidental, terrifying genius. It taps into the uncanny valley. It is recognisably a face, but it is not human. The long, rigid beak and the dark, glassy eyes create something alien, something that looks at you without seeing, that breathes without lungs. It dehumanises the wearer completely, turning a person into an implacable symbol. Horror creators seized upon this. The figure became a staple of internet folklore, most famously in the form of SCP-049. Within the collaborative fiction universe of the SCP Foundation, SCP-049 is a sentient entity that resembles a medieval plague doctor. It is calm, polite, and utterly convinced that humanity is infected with something it calls the pestilence. Its mission is to cure this affliction, but its methods are horrific. It kills its victims and then performs a crude surgery upon them, reanimating them as mindless zombies. Here, the horror is not just visual, it's conceptual. The Doctor's misguided desire to heal, a core part of his historical identity, is magnified into a monstrous world-ending obsession. The fiction perfectly captures the modern terror of the figure, a cold, clinical and utterly insane rationality that believes it is doing good while perpetrating unspeakable evil. The image proliferated across every medium. It became a Halloween costume of choice, a subject for countless pieces of dark fantasy art, a character in novels and a lurking presence in horror films. The modern Plague Doctor is a composite being, a creature born of history but raised by pop culture. It wears the 17th century costume of Charles de Lorme, but it carries the poisoned syringe of an assassin from a video game. It has the pseudo-scientific confidence of a steampunk inventor and the monstrous ambition of an internet horror story. It is a symbol detached from its own messy, tragic and deeply human history. It has become a perfect, polished icon of dread, a beautiful monster for a new age, its silhouette instantly recognisable, its true story almost entirely forgotten. For most of the world now, the Plague Doctor is not a failed civil servant from a bygone era. He is a myth, and like all powerful myths, his shadow stretches long, casting itself over new fears and new anxieties, waiting for the moment when the world would once again need a symbol for a time of plague. That moment was not far away. The mythic Plague Doctor, a creature of games and gothic fantasy, was abruptly and violently slammed back into reality in the early months of 2020. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, the centuries-old figure experienced a different kind of resurgence. This time it was not as a steampunk hero or a horror movie monster, but as a historical echo, a ghostly mirror reflecting our own contemporary crisis. Suddenly, the image of a figure in a bizarre, all-encompassing uniform designed to create a barrier against an invisible pestilence felt disturbingly familiar. The historical became contemporary. The past was no longer the past. The most immediate and striking parallel was, of course, the mask. For 300 years, the beaked mask of the Plague Doctor had been seen as an artefact of superstition and folly, a strange bird-like prosthesis filled with herbs, an object of grim curiosity. But as images of overwhelmed hospitals in Wuhan, Lombardy and New York City filled the news, we saw a new uniform of contagion fighting. We saw doctors and nurses entombed in layers of personal protective equipment. And at the centre of it all, was the mask. The N95 respirator, the surgical mask, the plastic face shield. The visual rhyme was undeniable. The long strange beak of the 17th century and the moulded sterile contours of the 21st century respirator served the exact same fundamental purpose: to protect the wearer's airway from a disease that travelled invisibly through the air. Here, however, the comparison illuminates a chasm of scientific understanding that is almost too vast to comprehend. Charles de Lorme's invention was a masterpiece of miasmatic theory. The enemy was bad air, a poisonous vapour, a corrupting stench that rose from filth and decaying matter. The defence, therefore, had to be aromatic. The beak of the mask was a pomander, a wearable potpourri holder stuffed with powerful scents designed to overpower and neutralise the evil air. Theriac, a complex concoction of over 50 ingredients including viper flesh and opium, was often smeared inside along with camphor, mint, cloves, juniper and ambergris. The doctor literally breathed his medicine. He walked through a cloud of his own protective perfume, his head encased in a fortress of fragrance. It was a logical solution to an incorrectly identified problem. It was the height of medical technology, built on a foundation of pure error. Contrast this with the modern hazmat suit. The enemy is not a smell, but a virus, a submicroscopic particle of genetic code wrapped in a protein shell, a biological machine designed for one purpose: replication. The defence is not aromatic, but mechanical and electrostatic. An N95 mask is not a pouch for potpourri, it is a marvel of material science. Its layers of non-woven polypropylene fibres are not just a simple sieve. They are designed to trap particles through a combination of interception, inertial impaction, diffusion, and, most importantly, an electrostatic charge that actively attracts and captures aerosolized viral particles. Every element of modern PPE is the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, of germ theory, of virology, of fluid dynamics. The impermeable Tyvek suit that replaced the plague doctor's waxed canvas coat is not just a barrier against miasma. It is a precisely engineered barrier against microscopic pathogens, tested and certified to exacting standards. The leap from the beaked mask to the N95 is the story of humanity's journey from magical thinking to the scientific method. One is a prayer whispered into a pouch of herbs, the other is a wall built of data. And yet, despite this gulf in knowledge, the human experience of wearing the uniform carries profound and timeless echoes. A doctor in 17th century Rome, suiting up to enter the plague wards of the lazaretto, would have felt a similar sense of ritualistic preparation as a nurse in 2020 preparing to enter an ICU. The slow, deliberate process of donning the protective layers, the waxed leather coat, heavy and stiff, the gloves, the hat, the hood, and finally the mask, sealing off the face, muffling the sounds of the outside world, narrowing the field of vision to what could be seen through two small glass circles. The world would have transformed, becoming distant and strange. One's own breathing would become the dominant sound, a constant reminder of the fragile barrier between the air inside the mask and the supposedly poisoned air outside. The modern healthcare worker experiences a version of this same transformation. The gown, the double gloves, the hairnet, the booties, the N95 pressed so tightly against the face it leaves painful indentations, the face shield fogging with every breath. The effect is one of profound isolation. The senses are dulled. Communication becomes difficult. Voice is muffled. The reassuring human touch, a fundamental part of caregiving, becomes impossible, mediated through layers of nitrile or vinyl. Both the historical plague doctor and the modern clinician become anonymous figures, their individuality erased by the uniform of their profession. They are no longer a person, they are a function, a representative of the medical system, a barrier against disease. This dehumanization, intended to protect the body, exacts a heavy psychological toll. It isolates the caregiver from the patient and from their colleagues, creating a lonely space in the heart of a crisis. Furthermore, both figures, ancient and modern, became symbols of dread to the communities they served. The arrival of the plague doctor at a house in plague-stricken London was a death sentence for the life that family had known. It meant the diagnosis was confirmed. The red cross would be painted on the door, the words, "Lord of mercy upon us," inscribed above it. The house would be sealed, the healthy trapped with the sick, a 40-day quarantine enforced by armed guards. The doctor was not a bringer of hope. He was the herald of the end, the official who certified the presence of the pestilence. He was feared and often reviled, a necessary evil who walked hand in hand with death. In the early panicked days of the COVID-19 pandemic, a similar, albeit less dramatic stigma attached itself to healthcare workers. They were hailed as heroes in public, with people clapping from their balconies, but in private they were often treated as vectors of disease. Landlords tried to evict nurses from their apartments. Neighbours avoided them in the grocery store. Friends and family kept their distance, terrified of the invisible enemy the doctor or nurse might be carrying on their clothes or their skin after a long shift in the COVID ward. Like their historical counterparts, they were praised for walking into the fire, but shunned for smelling of smoke. They inhabited a strange paradox, essential but contaminated, celebrated but feared. The uniform, whether a beaked mask or an N95, marked them as people who had crossed a line, who had willingly entered the contaminated space and who could never be seen as entirely clean by a terrified public again. The technology of protection had evolved beyond recognition, but the primal human fear of the contagion fighter, the person who consorts with death, had barely changed at all. What, then, does this strange masked figure, this spectre from a forgotten plague, still have to teach us? After its long journey from the filthy streets of 17th century Europe, through the imaginative worlds of steampunk and video games, and into the stark reflective light of our own modern pandemic, what is its final lesson? The enduring legacy of the Plague Doctor is not a simple one. He is not just a hero, not just a villain, not just a historical curiosity. He is a complex and deeply resonant symbol, a dark mirror reflecting three timeless truths about humanity's relationship with disease. First and foremost, the Plague Doctor remains our most potent symbol for the terror of pandemics. His image is a visceral memento mori, a reminder of our profound biological vulnerability. The silhouette alone, the black, all-encompassing cloak, the wide-brimmed hat obscuring the face, the stark alien beak, is the personification of pestilence. He is the Grim Reaper with a medical degree. When he appears, it signifies that the normal world has ended. It means that an invisible, indiscriminate enemy is moving through our communities, dissolving social bonds, and turning neighbours into sources of mortal danger. The Doctor's presence is an admission of chaos, a sign that the very air we breathe has become suspect. He represents a specific kind of fear that only a pandemic can create. The fear of our own bodies, our own homes, our own loved ones. He is the emblem of a world turned inside out, where the rituals of life, gathering, touching, caring for the sick, become acts of suicide. In his dark, shrouded form, we see the fragility of all our systems, the thinness of the veneer of civilization that separates order from a mass grave. Second, the Plague Doctor stands as a monument to the fallibility of science and the humility required to face the unknown. The beaked mask is the perfect emblem of this. It was not a product of ignorance or superstition in the way we might think of a magical amulet. It was the absolute apex of the medical science of its day, born from the most advanced, rational theory of disease transmission they possessed, the miasma theory. Learned men in universities, physicians to kings, the best and the brightest of their time, believed with absolute certainty that this device would work. And they were completely, utterly wrong. The mask offered at best a psychological comfort, and at worst a false sense of security that may have led to more infections. This is a profoundly humbling lesson. It reminds us that our own certainty is not a guarantee of truth. The knowledge we hold today, which feels so complete and so powerful, may seem as quaint and misguided to future generations as the theory of bad air seems to us. The Doctor's mask teaches us that science is not a collection of immutable facts, but a process of constant questioning, a journey of correcting errors, often with fatal consequences along the way. It is a symbol of humanity doing its absolute best with the information it has, and still failing catastrophically. It embodies our best intentions and our most tragic limitations, a reminder that we are always, in some way, fighting in the dark. And yet, this leads to the third and perhaps most important lesson. Despite the terror he represents and the scientific failure he embodies, the Plague Doctor is also an enduring symbol of human persistence. He is a testament to our stubborn, often irrational, refusal to surrender to despair. Consider the reality of the man behind the mask. He was often not a respected, established physician. Those men had often fled to their country estates at the first sign of plague. The municipal plague doctor was frequently a young doctor trying to start a career, a second-rate practitioner who couldn't find other work, or even a layman who was simply willing to do the job for a high salary and the promise of citizenship. He was, in short, a man with few other options. And yet he put on the uniform. He walked into the quarantined houses, he faced the dying, listened to their last confessions, recorded their names in the civic ledgers. He performed a grim, essential, and terrifying job that no one else wanted. His treatments were largely useless. His lancing of buboes, his prescriptions of potions, his advice to burn sweet-smelling wood, none of it could halt the relentless march of Yersinia pestis. But his presence meant that society had not completely collapsed. It meant that someone was still counting, still trying, still confronting the abyss. It was an act of organised resistance, however futile. In this, the Plague Doctor symbolises the fundamental human impulse to do something in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. To put on a uniform, to create a ritual, to impose a system, however flawed, onto chaos. It is the same impulse that drove modern scientists to work around the clock to develop a vaccine, and the same impulse that drove nurses and doctors into ICUs day after day, even when they knew they could not save everyone. It is the spirit of humanity's long, desperate, and unending struggle against disease. The shadow of the Plague Doctor, therefore, is a long and complicated one. It stretches from the plague pits of the 17th century to the sterile corridors of the 21st. He is a monster from a horror story, and he is a civil servant doing a thankless job. He is a symbol of failed science, and he is a symbol of the courage to act in the face of that failure. He is a terrifying figure who reminds us of our own mortality, and a strangely comforting one who reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there will always be someone willing to put on the mask and walk toward the plague. His story is not just the history of a costume, but the history of who we are and who we are forced to become when the world falls ill.